I'm just a rock chick.
I would describe my music and my sound as Avril Lavigne.
It's the best damn thing.
Welcome to the introductory episode of the Best Damn Avril Lavigne Podcast, a facts and trivia-based podcast about Canadian pop singer Avril Lavigne. I'm your host, Andrea DiFrancesco. The first episode of this podcast is episode 0, which is an introduction to the Best Damn Avril Lavigne Podcast. I'll also tell you a little bit about myself, my history as an Avril fan, and why I started this podcast. So what I was thinking is that the initial episodes will be facts and trivia about Avril's music and career, with later episodes to be more discussion-based, like the conspiracy theory that she's dead, or why hasn't she won a Grammy yet, the controversy about if Hello Kitty is actually racist, and much more. So a little bit of history and background about when and how I became a fan. I've been a fan for most of my life. I've been a fan pretty much since the beginning of her career. I've been a fan since Complicated, since Let Go. I was about 8 or 9 when Complicated and Let Go came out. And I remember hearing Complicated on the radio, and I didn't know the song or the artist, but I just know that I really liked the song. And months later, I saw her perform on the TV show All That. She performed Complicated, and everything about that performance just really resonated with me. It was like the outfit she was wearing and the song she was singing, the way she was singing, the way she was performing, her whole attitude and everything just really resonated with me as a 9-year-old. And I hadn't really properly listened to a lot of artists at that point. She was like my real introduction into pop music, I guess. And so I just kept watching that performance over and over again. And my parents noticed, and my dad found out that she had an album called Let Go, and so he got it for me, and I played that album every day after school in 4th and 5th grade, and I've just been a fan ever since. And it's interesting because in the early 2000s, when Avril's career was first happening, the internet wasn't at all like it is today, and social media basically didn't exist. So it was really difficult to keep up with artists back then, unless you were reading magazines about them or watching MTV and VH1 and stuff like that. And my family didn't really have good internet access back then. So, and we only had one family computer and stuff. So I ended up learning a lot of my information much later, actually, and started following her career a lot more properly, probably between The Best Damn Thing and Goodbye Lullaby. How I get the facts I'm going to put in these episodes and how I came to learn all this information honestly just comes from being a fan for so long. I'm in my late 20s at this point, so I have been with her pretty much since day one. She's been in the music industry for almost 20 years at this point. So just over the years of watching a lot of her interviews, once they became a lot more readily available on YouTube and stuff, reading a lot of her magazine interviews, watching her video interviews, and also being able to actually follow the eras as they happened in real time, which didn't start to happen until the Goodbye Lullaby era. Like I said, the internet was a lot more developed by that point. So a lot of this stuff I learned kind of retrospectively. And of course, using sources like Wikipedia that have sources attached to them when it comes to charts and sales figures and stuff like that. I also learned a lot of information from other fans as well, people who have been around for a lot longer than I have, or who were older at the time when she started her career that kind of remember stuff in more detail. So in 2009, I discovered the fan site Avril Band-Aids, which is the #1 English-speaking Avril Lavigne fan site in the world. It used to be a lot bigger back in its heyday, and now it kind of just exists as a forum over on Pro Boards, but it still does exist, and I'm actually on the staff over there. I've been a member of that site since 2009 when I was trying to find information about her 4th album, and I just stumbled upon that website, and it is a great place for people who love Avril and just love discussing her, people who like that kind of forum format as opposed to social media. I think that it lends itself to more conversation, more discussion than social media does. And so I learned a lot of information over there. Somehow people would just find out information somehow before Avril herself even announced it. People who have been fans for a lot longer, people who maybe have met her personally and stuff like that. I learned a lot of information from over there as well. So I wanted to start this podcast because I'm a huge fan. And over the last year during the pandemic and quarantine and all of that, I really started listening to a lot of podcasts. I never was a huge podcast listener, but I started listening to a lot of them. And the idea just sounded really fun to me. And I was kind of like, well, what can I do a podcast about? And I've always been a big fan of Avril and always like just knew a lot of information about her. And surprisingly, when I tried searching on Apple Podcasts to see if there was an existing Avril podcast, I didn't find one. And I was like, I guess I could just start one. That was where the whole idea came from. And I really, even though I'm hosting this podcast by myself, I really actually want this to be as interactive as possible. To me, this is a podcast by Avril fans for Avril fans, and, you know, maybe have some future guests at some point. Like on those episodes I was talking about that in the future will be more discussion based, like the theory that she's dead and all this stuff. I just think it would be so much fun to get other people's thoughts on these things and really have like a dialogue about it. And also, you know, even if you can't come on as a guest, you can still feel free to send in like comments or audio clips. Like if you just record yourself talking on your phone and like send me like a voice memo kind of thing, and I can like insert it into the show. Questions, episode ideas, or like just anything that you want to know about Avril and like see if I can answer it maybe. So I do have an official podcast page on Instagram at Best Damn Avril Pod. So you can message me over there, or you can send me an email at bestdamnavrilpod@yahoo.com. And all this information will be in the show notes. So just some like housekeeping kind of things, I guess, like the reason why I wanted to do an episode 0 before launching into the first actual episode is just to kind of introduce people to the show, and some housekeeping things like as far as the schedule. So I don't really have a set schedule for now. Like I work full time and that sort of thing. So it's not like I have all this time to devote to podcasting, but you know, the idea for me was like, I really just wanted to do this mostly for fun. So I don't want to feel like pressure to get an episode out every single week, but I will do the best that I can to post weekly. But I think that I would like to put the podcast out on Fridays, because to me, it's just like, you know, it's the Best Damn Avril Lavigne podcast. I'm like, it's just like, you know, Avril's always been really high energy and fun. And I just think that it's like the perfect way to start your weekend is like, yeah, with like the Best Damn Avril Lavigne podcast. So I don't really have like a set schedule for sure, but I will do my best to post weekly on Fridays. And if there's ever like a week where I have to take off or something, then you can check the podcast page on Instagram and I'll probably post an update if I'm like not able to get an episode out or something for that week. Another thing is that as far as like how the show is categorized, like whether it's clean or explicit, for the most part, I plan for the show to be clean. Like I'm not going to just, you know, intermittently swear during the show. I don't plan on doing that. But because we are talking about Avril Lavigne and like there's episodes I'm planning on doing about like some of her song lyrics and stuff that happen to be explicit, I'm going to do kind of like on an episode by episode basis. You know, if we happen to be talking about explicit lyrics or something like that in the episode, then that particular episode will be marked as explicit. And I will try to put like a disclaimer or something in the beginning of the episode. Anytime we talk about anything explicit or sensitive content or anything like that, I will try to put, you know, disclaimers at the beginning of the episode or in the show notes as well. But for the most part, I plan for this podcast to be clean and as family friendly as I can be. The last thing I want to mention is I want to give a shout out to a music producer called JPalFlix for the use of his music and tracks for the theme music that I've used for the podcast. The music that you hear in the introduction is called HD, and the music that you'll hear at the close is called Lights. He was very gracious enough to let me use his royalty-free tracks for this podcast. So I will link his Instagram page and stuff like that down in the show notes as well if you want to go give him a follow if you like what you hear. So a very special thank you to JPalFlix for letting me use his music as well. The last thing I want to mention before we wrap up is I would very much appreciate it if you could subscribe to the podcast. It will be available on pretty much any podcast platform like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, all those things. If you subscribe that way, whenever there's a new episode, it pops up immediately in your feed. You don't have to go searching for it. And also if you could leave a rating and or a review, that also helps the podcast show up better in the algorithm. So if you are so inclined, I would very much appreciate that as well. And so with that, we wrap up this edition of the Best Damn Avril Lavigne Podcast. You can subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed this episode, the next one is actually available right now, where we'll learn some interesting facts and trivia about Avril before she was famous. Do you know the name of the street Avril lived on growing up, or the first chord she learned to play on guitar? Find out next time on the Best Damn Avril Lavigne Podcast. The Best Damn Avril Lavigne Podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Andrea DiFrancesco. Theme music is HD and Lights by JPalFlix. Follow the latest podcast news on Instagram at bestdamnavrilpod or email bestdamnavrilpod@yahoo.com.